The Orchids of Room 313, Part 1. Ethan Caldwell had worked security jobs before, warehouse patrols, mall closing shifts, even an overnight watch at a quarry. But the Crescent Hotel in Black Hollow was different. The place carried silence like a disease. Its halls smelled of plaster dust and long-cured tobacco, of cedar long since rotted beneath flacking paint. Chandeliers swayed even when no draft passed through. Locals called it a tomb with wallpaper. Ethan only called it a paycheck. Still, he could never ignore room 313. On the roster, the room didn't exist. The ledger used by Marcus Tate, the hotel's careful owner, skipped from 312 to 314 without apology, as if enumeration itself were an act of superstition. But the brass numerals on the third-floor door gleamed all the same, freshly polished every night by no human hand. When Ethan's flashlight swept past, the threes winked like mirrored eyes. He had a list of rules. Marcus had printed them on cardstock the color of old bone, and the paper had acquired a curl as if it disliked being flat. Do not enter room 313 after midnight. Do not look into the mirror in the hall if you hear singing. If the lamp in 313 is lit, log the time and do not touch it. Call me if the orchids are white. Call Clara Voss if you hear the name Abigail. There were more mundane lines about radio check-ins, about the circuitous path of the cameras because several zones were dead. But those first instructions lived behind Ethan's eyes. He told himself he followed the rules because he was a professional. He suspected he followed them because they felt like the edges of a cliff. On his 7th week, a storm drifted low over Black Hollow and barked at the hills. The hotel took to the thunder as a ship takes to swell. Every joist groaned, every vent whistled, every sheet of boarded glass rattled its slow applause. Ethan started his first round with the taste of copper on his tongue and a smear of dust across the screen of his handheld. The cameras fizzled to black, came back, coughed out bands of snow. He muttered into his radio. South stairwell clear, lobby clear. Ballroom, he hesitated. The ballroom was a cathedral of made things. Columns painted to resemble marble, a ceiling mural cracked into constellations, gilded vents no one had cleaned since Truman. In that sudden hush between thunderbolts, he could hear a shoe scuffing across the ballroom's parquet floor. "Who's there?" he said, which was a stupid question even as his mouth formed it. The scuffing stopped. Something loomed behind the stage curtain like a breath held too long. Ethan stood very still. He felt the rules like reins tugging him backward. He did not raise the curtain. He did not say the name he was not supposed to say. He resumed his round and told himself that a rat can sound like a man if the room is big enough. By the time he climbed to the 3rd floor, midnight was near. The hallway here was narrower, the carpet a corridor of burgundy swallowed by shadow. Room 309 held stacks of folded chairs. Room 310 smelled of oil and wet pennies. Room 311 had a wallpaper pattern of climbing magnolia that always seemed to be mid-reach. And then came the short gap with the radiator and the cracked oval mirror, its silver backing gone to rust, its surface holding a stain like a thumbprint, followed by the wide bay where room 313 stood with polished numerals and a keyhole that had never taken a modern keycard. The oil lamp was burning within. He saw it through the transom above the door, an amber tear. His watch hand crawled toward midnight, 3 minutes to go. The rule said, if the lamp is lit, log the time and do not touch it. Ethan wrote the time in the little notebook he kept clipped to his belt. He did not touch the door. He did not name what the warmth against his palm was, fear or the memory of a fever. He moved on toward 314, whose door never fully latched, and set his footfalls to a rhythm meant to sound like indifference. On his second pass that night, after the storm cracked open and the town's power hiccuped, the lamp still burned. Fresh orchids stood on the little table inside the door, white petals cupping pale light, though the hotel had no florist, no deliveries, no staff but Ethan and Marcus on late nights. The brass shackles fixed to the inside wall gleamed as if someone had just breathed on them and polished away the fog with a sleeve. The bedspread lay smooth. The pillow corner wore the crease of a recent hand. Ethan swallowed. He wrote the time again. He did not touch the knob. He found Marcus in the office at 1 in the morning, sleeves rolled, tie loose, eyes the color of the coffee he was not drinking. "It's lit again," Ethan said. "Orchids are white." Marcus's fingers paused over the ledger. Each line in it was written in his neat and upright hand. Each line was a way of standing between the past and a lawsuit. White like snow or white like bone. "Is there a difference?" "You'd be surprised." Marcus rose, collected a ring of keys, a flashlight, and the bone-colored card stock with the rules as if he might need to remind the night itself of its obligations. "We'll do a pass. We'll keep to the door." They walked in silence under chandeliers that still twitched. On the third floor, Marcus did not look into the mirror. He set his palm against the wall between 312 and the radiator as if testing a pulse. When they faced 313, he let the keys hang quiet. "You hear anything?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. He wanted to say thunder and footsteps, but thunder was a mask for everything and footsteps, when you named them, became invitations. Marcus noted the time in his own book and stared at the transom's ribbon of fire. "Some lamps burn on air," he said. "Some burn on memory. That's supposed to be comforting." "It's supposed to be true." Marcus slid a small brass wedge under the door to keep it from swinging in the draft. It was a gesture that admitted the door might swing. "I'll call Clara later. If you hear singing, go downstairs. Not to the lobby, downstairs. All the way, you understand." Ethan nodded, though the stairs to the basement annoyed him in a way he couldn't articulate, the way a tooth with a hairline crack catches cold water. He watched the lamp's flame lift as if acknowledging his attention and then lower itself like a bow. When they left, he knew the wedge would stay where it was, and the lamp would keep its own counsel. At 2:13, while Ethan was nodding that the radiator on the third floor had gone from warm to too warm, he heard a lullaby. It came from the cracked oval mirror as if the glass itself were a throat. The melody was simple and repetitive, the sort of tune people hum when their hands are busy and their minds only half attending. "Hush, hush, little one. Hush, hush, little one." The words slid against his ears like hands as gentle as they were unwelcome. He did not look into the mirror. "Downstairs," he breathed to himself. "Downstairs all the way." He made it as far as the landing before the stairwell swallowed the song. He waited there, 1 foot lower than the other, balance tilted toward retreat. When the song did not return, he continued to the lobby, crossed the checkerboard tile to the office, and called Clara Voss. She answered on the second ring, voice hoarse with sleep, and yet fully awake in the way of people who sleep with their hand poised over a question. "What did it sing?" she asked, before he could finish giving his name. "A lullaby." "Yes, but whose?" Ethan looked at the office doorway and saw, absurdly, that he had turned the brass knob 90 degrees and kept it there as if anyone were coming through. "It didn't feel like mine." "No," Clara said, not unkindly. "It wouldn't. I'll be by at dawn with the county probate book. Did Marcus tell you about the dates?" "He told me a lot without telling me anything." "December 12th is the date that matters," she said. "Write it down. If it wants you to know, it will show you." When he hung up, Marcus was standing in the office doorway, one hand in his pocket, the other around a paper cup that did not steam. "Don't let her feed you the whole story at once," Marcus said. "It overwhelms men. Men or cowards. In my experience, there's overlap." At 3, the cameras failed completely. Snow on every screen, then black. Ethan took the long route. Kitchen, service corridor, linen storage, the little chapel whose pews still bore polished indentations like thumb grooves where knees had once pressed, and then up the service stairs toward the third floor. The hotel wheezed and settled. He noted the smell of roses and old pennies in a place that ought to have smelled of nothing at all. Near the landing he heard a soft wooden knock, steady as a heartbeat. He thought at first it was the radiator again, until the knock unfolded into a creak and a cradle's slow rhythm. The sound came from behind 313's door, no, not behind, within the sound of the door, as if the wood had learned to rock itself. The rules said nothing about cradles. The card in his pocket had not imagined the pivot of that sound. Ethan put his ear to the door despite himself. The lamp guttered, sensed, then steadied. The orchids, visible now in a sliver through the jamb, were white like bone, petals slightly translucent, their throats freckled faint pink. He smelled milk and starch. He smelled the faintest ribbon of lavender the way a store-bought sachet remembers a field. "Abigail," he said, though he wasn't supposed to say the name unless he called Clara first. The syllables left his mouth like a loan he couldn't repay. The cradle stopped. The lullaby began again, closer, as if sung into his mouth by someone standing on the other side of the wood. His hands lifted without his consent. He touched the door. It was warm, not the warmth of heat, but the warmth of breath. The brass numerals tingled as if they had a pulse. He had the key. Marcus had never given him the key, but Ethan found that the ring of old iron in his pocket had grown one more tooth, and his fingers knew which it was. He considered, then obeyed a more primal rule. Do not let a child cry alone. He slid the key into the mouth of the lock. The door opened to a room that had never truly been empty. Ethan's flashlight, for once, refused to lead. Its beam wavered around the edges of the oil lamp's core as if light could be ashamed. The bed stood made in a simple iron frame. The window was latched. The drapes stirred a fraction as if someone had just passed by them. On the far wall the brass shackles gleamed and a faint ribbon of skin oil still lived on their curves, recent and human and not his. The table beneath the lamp held a ceramic pitcher and a single small cup with a chip in the rim shaped like a crescent moon. Beside the table, occupying the floor with the naturalness of furniture that belonged there, stood a cradle. It was not of the hotel's era. Its paint had peeled in long, curling shavings that had drifted down to join dust. One rocker had been mended with twine. A stain had soaked the grain where a mattress would have been, brown at the edges, black in the seam. Ethan's stomach turned and then, inexplicably, calmed. Night would return, and with it the lamp, the orchids, the cradle, and the choice for Ethan. The Orchids of Room 313, Part 2. The morning after the cradle appeared, Ethan lingered in the lobby long after Marcus left. Dawn streamed through the dust-smeared windows in pale bands, igniting the flecks of plaster, as if the air itself wanted to remind him that the hotel had once been full of light. Clara Voss was there too, her box of probate records already spread across the desk, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She looked like someone preparing to take dictation from the dead. "You saw her, didn't you?" Clara asked. She didn't look up from her notes, only tapped her pencil against the column of names. Not just the cradle, the face. Ethan rubbed his wrist, the faint red band still imprinted there. "I don't know what I saw, but it wanted me shackled." Clara closed the ledger. "Abigail Harrow," she said, speaking the name with the precision of a teacher introducing a lesson. "Dressmaker, born 1889, died 1910. She was kept in that room against her will." "Kept by who?" She lifted a photograph from her box. The sepia showed a man in a dark three-piece suit, eyes stern and lips pressed thin. Ethan recognized something uncomfortably familiar in the shape of the jaw, the downturn of the brows. "Victor Caldwell," Clara said. "Your great-great-grandfather." Ethan's stomach turned. "No, that can't." Marcus entered then, carrying 2 cups of coffee so black they smelled like burned wood. "It can," Marcus said. "It did. Victor owned this place, and whatever cruelty he hid, the walls remember it." He handed 1 cup to Ethan. "The Caldwell name has weight here, Ethan. The hotel feels it. Abigail feels it." Clara began a lecture that was more than a lecture. It was an act of excavation. She described the year 1910 when the copper boom had swelled Black Hollow's population. Miners filled the hotel's bar, families filled the dining hall. But behind the walls in room 313, Victor Caldwell had hidden his scandal. Abigail was his seamstress, young, unmarried, already carrying his child. When gossip threatened to bloom, Victor chained her in the one room that guests never reached. She died there, her baby Lily stillborn beside her. The birth certificate was never filed. The grave was never marked. Ethan listened, cold crawling up his arms. And now she wants me. She doesn't want you, Clara corrected. She wants truth. She wants the world to know her name again. Spirits don't haunt out of whim, Ethan. They haunt because someone buried their voice. Marcus folded his arms. And you're the only Caldwell left in this town. She sees you as the ledger she can write her story in. The next nights blurred together. Room 313 remained pristine each dusk, orchids replenished, the lamp breathing its stubborn flame. Ethan patrolled the other floors, but his ears strained for the lullaby. Sometimes it came soft from the hall mirror. Other times it swelled until every window pane quivered. He began to recognize its rhythm, 3 notes rising, 1 falling. It lodged in his skull like an unfinished thought. He avoided the room after midnight, but the hotel had other ideas. Once he found the cradle dragged into the hall. Once the shackles clinked, though no one touched them. Another night, a voice called his name from behind the door, but the syllables were elongated, stretched until they felt like a rope tightening around his chest. He nearly turned the knob before Marcus's warning, almost as a season, echoed through his head. Clara arrived each dawn, piecing together Abigail's life from yellowed newspapers, sewing guild rosters and an old diary half-eaten by mold. She read passages aloud in her precise voice. Abigail Harrow, apprenticed at 15, earned her keep by hemming miners' trousers, saved for a Singer sewing machine she never owned, known to hum lullabies her mother taught her. Ethan felt each word dig like a needle. The second week after the cradle, Ethan returned to the 3rd floor at dusk and found Marcus standing outside 313. The door was ajar. Inside, the air smelled of roses and rust. The cradle rocked on its own. "She's impatient," Marcus said. His face was pale under the failing light. "The anniversaries are stacking." "What anniversaries?" Ethan asked. "Her death, Victor's death, the birth that never was. This place marks them all, whether the calendar agrees or not." Ethan stared at the cradle. "What happens if I step inside?" "You'll find out what Victor left unfinished," Marcus said, "but you won't come out the same." That night Ethan dreamed he was shackled to the wall of 313. The lamp's flame bent toward him like an eye. Across the room, a young woman sat in the cradle instead of a child, humming softly. Her hair was damp, her dress soaked in blood that never dried. She reached her arms toward him, not pleading but commanding. "A tone," she whispered, lips never moving. "A tone." When he woke, his wrist throbbed where the cuff had marked him. Clara insisted they test a ritual of acknowledgement. At dusk, she placed the photograph of Abigail on the carpet outside the door, beside it a scrap of fabric cut from a century-old dress she had preserved. "Recognition," she whispered. "The first step toward peace." The air shifted, cool and thick. Ethan thought he heard a sigh travel through the corridor, a sound not angry, not forgiving, but waiting. The lamp inside flared once, as if to answer. Ethan whispered, "I'm sorry." The word felt small in his mouth, but it was all he had. The orchids turned from white to deep red in the span of a blink. Marcus cursed, "Not good." The cradle slammed once against the floor. The door shuddered but did not open. A lullaby shrieked through the keyhole, warped and sharp like nails dragged across glass. Clara snatched up the photograph before the wind could tear it away. "She isn't ready to forgive," Clara said, voice firm even as her hands trembled. "Not yet, we need more, we need the whole truth." For the next nights, Ethan felt hunted. The hotel's corridors narrowed. Shadows pooled even where no lamp should have cast them. The camera feeds blacked out whenever he approached 313, snow filling the screens like static-choked memories. Once he found orchids strewn along the stairwell, petals crushed under invisible feet. Another time he heard a baby's cry echoing from the ballroom. Each time he forced himself to continue, writing notes in his ledger that made little sense. Orchids red, cradle angry, mirror sang. Clara pressed him harder. "She's showing you her death," Clara said one dawn, laying out another diary fragment. "Victor's cruelty went beyond her. He silenced others too. If we don't name them, her rage will keep growing." Ethan felt the chain ghost his wrist again. He stared at his reflection in the lobby's cracked window, seeing in his jaw the echo of Victor. "Then we'll name them," he said. "Every one." Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright. "That's the beginning of atonement." One night, Ethan returned to 313 to find the cradle gone. In its place stood a small mound of dirt in the center of the carpet, damp and fresh as if dug that morning. From it sprouted 6 white orchids. Their stems bled red at the roots. Clara arrived breathless minutes later, summoned by his call. She crouched by the mound, touching the soil. "It's starting," she murmured. "She's opening the other graves." "The other what?" Ethan asked. "Victor's other secrets. She's not alone. She never was." Clara rose, brushing dirt from her palms. "The walls have been waiting to confess." Ethan felt the air tighten around him. The lamp flickered twice. The shackles clinked against the wall, and the lullaby rose again, this time joined by other voices, a rough choir of the forgotten. He turned to Clara. "What do we do?" Clara closed her notebook with finality. "We dig deeper. We let the hotel speak, and then we tell the world." The orchids swayed as if in agreement. The mound of soil crumbled further, revealing the edge of a rusted shoe buckle, the bone of a finger, and a name whispered through the corridor. "John, 1 of 6. Ethan backed away, heart hammering, but the lamp flared, demanding he stay. Clara's gaze hardened. "This is only the beginning. Abigail has shown you the first. She'll show you the others. You can't run from it, Ethan. You have to see it through." The hallway seemed to pulse with invisible breath. The mirror across from the door fogged and cleared, revealing fleeting silhouettes. A miner, a barmaid, a nurse. Each carried the weight of silence. Each waited to be named. Ethan swallowed, throat raw. "Then we'll give them names." Clara touched his shoulder. "And graves." The lullaby softened, fatting back into the room as if satisfied with his vow. The orchid stilled. The soil ceased crumbling, but the air remained heavy, as though the walls themselves held back the rest of the story until the right night arrived. At dawn, Ethan sat in the office alone, Marcus gone to the town council, Clara asleep over her books. He wrote in his ledger, "Atone, Abigail, Lily, John." The ink bled into the paper, each name a wound that would not close. He stared at the words until the sunlight turned them red. And in the silence that followed, he knew the hotel was not finished. It had only begun to open its ledger of sins. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The hotel waited, silent, patient, its corridors breathing as though the walls had lungs. The Orchids of Room 313, Part 3. The hotel did not sleep after Abigail revealed John's name. It only learned to whisper more clearly. Ethan patrolled the halls with his flashlight, yet every beam seemed swallowed a few feet from its source, as if the walls were practicing secrets. Clara's notebooks multiplied across Marcus's office, each page layered with names, diagrams of the floor plan, and sketches of artifacts the rooms had begun to yield. Night after night, the third floor grew heavier. Room 313's door no longer stood alone. One by one, 6 other doors creaked open across the corridor. Each revealed something small, ordinary, and dreadful. In 315, a barmaid's apron hung stiff with old wine stains that were not wine. In 316, a cracked bellhop's cap lay on a chair. 317 smelled of ether and stale blood, and a nurse's spectacles rested on the sill. In 318, a cook's ladle clattered without touch. In 319, a child's wooden doll rocked silently. Clara listed each: Eliza Kane, Samuel Holt, Margaret Wren, Daniel Fong, Lucy Tate, and John Marrow. 6 souls caught in the orbit of Victor Caldwell's cruelty. 6 demands for recognition. Ethan felt their presence sharpen. The air tasted metallic, his wrist burned anew, and his dreams carried the weight of chains. He dreamed of corridors where the doors multiplied endlessly, each with a name he had not yet learned, each demanding he walk through. When he woke, the orchids in the lobby vase had turned black at the tips. One Friday night, an urban explorer broke in. Ethan spotted the teenager's flashlight beam skimming across the ballroom and caught up before the kid reached the stairwell. "This place isn't safe," Ethan warned, gripping the boy's shoulder. But the boy shrugged him off, muttering about haunted hotel videos and easy subscribers. Before Ethan could drag him outside, the air thickened. A lullaby poured down the stairwell, louder than Ethan had ever heard, wrapping around them both like a net. The boy froze, eyes wide, moving as if pulled by invisible strings toward the 3rd floor. "Stop," Ethan shouted, but the boy's steps kept climbing. The flashlight clattered to the tiles. The song sharpened into a wail. Marcus came running from the office, but they were seconds too late. The boy reached the cracked oval mirror and stared straight into it. He screamed. His reflection twisted, hollowed, his mouth stretching until it tore into silence. Abigail's face replaced his in the glass, eyes burning with grief and fury. The boy convulsed, then collapsed. Ethan dragged him back by the arms, terrified the spirit would take him whole. The mirror fogged, then cleared, leaving Ethan's own pale face staring back. The boy survived but left unconscious, muttering Abigail's name even in sleep. Marcus called an ambulance under a false report of heat stroke. As sirens faded, Ethan stood trembling in the hall, certain that next time Abigail would not settle for almost. Clara's research grew frantic. She uncovered property deeds, coroner's notes, missing person bulletins. All pointed to Victor. The more evidence she found, the stronger the manifestations became. The walls sweated with damp, the chandeliers swung without cause, and sometimes the oil lamp in 313 ignited in full daylight. "She's accelerating," Clara said, spreading documents across the desk. "The hotel is unspooling faster than we can catch it." "What does she want?" Ethan asked. "Justice," Clara said. "Graves, names carved where silence was." Marcus frowned. "Or she just wants blood." Ethan slammed his notebook shut. "Then we give her something better. We give her truth." That night Ethan entered 315. The barmaid's apron stirred on its own. A faint scent of gin rose in the air. He whispered the name Clara had written, Eliza Kane. For a moment the air softened. The apron fell still. Then from the adjoining room, 316, the bellhop's cap slid across the floor as though nudged by a restless foot. Ethan whispered again, "Samuel Holt." His throat tightened with each syllable, as if the names themselves weighed more than breath. When he reached 317, the nurse's spectacles gleamed. A chill pressed through his ribs. "Margaret Wren," he said, and the smell of ether thickened until his eyes watered. In 318, the ladle rose and struck the wall with a clang. "Daniel Fong." His voice trembled, but the ladle clattered once more and stilled. In 319, the doll tipped forward. "Lucy Tate," he whispered, barely audible. The doll's painted eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like relief. And in 320, the miner's boot shifted deeper in. The hallway quieted. For the first time, Ethan felt less hunted and more summoned. As if by speaking their names, he had been accepted into their ledger. But Abigail was not appeased. That night she appeared full in the mirror, no longer blurred, her face contorted with fury. "Not enough," she hissed. The glass shuddered. Ethan's reflection split down the middle, one side his own, the other Victor, cruel and grinning. The cuff mark seared his wrist anew. He staggered back as the lullaby screamed through the hall, shaking every door. Clara dragged him away before the mirror shattered. "She needs a vow," Clara said, voice fierce as they barricaded the office. "She won't rest until you promise her everything. Graves, memorial, justice. Not just words in a notebook." Ethan stared at his blistered wrist. "Then I'll promise," he whispered, "whatever it takes." The hotel groaned as though it had heard, beams settling like bones. The oil lamp upstairs flared so bright it sent a beam down the stairwell. The orchids on the lobby desk turned from black to white again. A lullaby, softer now, hummed through the walls. Abigail was waiting. And Ethan knew part 4 of this haunting had already begun to write itself in him. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dust curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dust curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dusk curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dusk curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dusk curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dust curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dusk curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The chandeliers clicked faintly, a sound too precise to be made by wood or chain. Ethan thought of the other names Clara had not yet uncovered, the ones perhaps still hidden in the walls. Clara marked dates in her ledger, each circle around a day tightening like a noose. Marcus smoked alone in the courtyard, exhaling into the dark as if bargaining with it. The orchids in the lobby browned at the edges, their wilt as eloquent as any voice. Every corridor echoed with the sense of footsteps just withdrawn, an audience that refused to leave. In his dreams, Ethan heard chains drop one by one, measuring time instead of hours. The hotel, immense and watchful, seemed to breathe with them all, storing their every vow. Outside, the desert wind brushed the shutters like a restless hand. Dust curled under the doorframes as though the earth itself leaned closer to listen. The Orchids of Room 313, Part 4. The vow hung heavier than any shackle. Ethan carried it in his chest like borrowed iron, each breath dragging across its edges. The hotel seemed to sense the promise. Corridors stretched, chandeliers hummed, mirrors fogged at his passing. Clara worked by lamplight in Marcus's office, drafting lists of names, drawing maps of memorial gardens, and marking the calendar with a circle that looked like a wound. Marcus grew more withdrawn, but his eyes carried the look of a man resigned to spend his fortune on silence. Ethan dreamed often. In one dream, Abigail stood in the cradle holding Lily's ghost to her breast. In another, Victor Caldwell smiled at him from the mirror, adjusting his tie, whispering, "Atonement is weakness." Ethan woke each time with sweat and the cuff mark burning as if lit from within. He began keeping vigil outside 313 at midnight, notebook on his knee, whispering apologies that the walls absorbed like dry earth drinking rain. One night Clara confronted him in the hall. "You can't keep talking to her like this," she said. "It gives her too much power." "She already has power," Ethan answered. "If I don't speak, she screams louder. She doesn't want apologies, she wants proof, monuments, graves." Clara's voice trembled with fatigue and conviction. "She won't let go until we build something that outlasts your breath." Marcus arrived, his tie askew. "Then we'll build it. Money is only paper until it's spent, but stone speaks." Ethan looked from Marcus to Clara, and then to the door of 313, its brass numerals gleaming faintly in the gaslight. "When?" "December 12th, Clara said without hesitation. "The anniversary of Victor's death. If we consecrate the memorial that day, the cemetery may give her peace." "Then we work," Marcus said. "No delays." Preparations consumed them. Clara delved deeper into archives, gathering fragments of the other 6 lives. John Marrow, the miner crushed by debt. Eliza Kane, the barmaid silenced for overheard gossip. Samuel Holt, the bellhop who vanished after asking too many questions. Margaret Wren, the nurse who suspected Victor's abuses. Daniel Fong, the cook who saw too much. Lucy Tate, a child whose laughter ended abruptly. Their artifacts remained in the rooms, waiting like witnesses. Clara transcribed their stories, refusing to let one name escape her pen. She wrote dates in a careful hand, drew family trees where branches had been cut, and taped newspaper clippings to the wall until the office looked like a courtroom assembling its case. Marcus contacted masons, ordered stone slabs, and negotiated with the council for a memorial garden on the hotel's grounds. "They think I've lost my mind," he told Ethan one evening. "Maybe I have, but better madness than silence." He paced between the plans and the window, rehearsing speeches for a ceremony he feared no one would attend. "We owe them what the town never gave," he said, more to the building than to Ethan. "We owe them an ending." Ethan scouted the property at dawn, measuring the rectangle where the garden would sit, a stretch of hard soil by the east wall where the sun touched first. He pictured a path of crushed granite, a low wall of local stone, a central plinth bearing 7 names: Abigail Harrow, Lily Harrow, John Marrow, Eliza Kane, Samuel Holt, Margaret Wren, Daniel Fong, Lucy Tate. He kept adding the child's name twice by accident, as if the wall itself insisted that her absence be counted more than once. He erased and wrote again. The hotel's resistance grew sharper as the date approached. Doors slammed without wind. Radiators scalded at random. A chandelier fell in the ballroom, missing Ethan by inches and embedding a crystal spear in the parquet. Clara found her research scattered across the floor one morning, pages shredded by invisible claws. She gathered them calmly, as if accepting the price of knowledge. "She's testing us," Clara said, "making sure we don't turn away." They did not. Ethan endured the worst. The lullaby became constant, filling his skull until he could not tell silence from sound. Once he looked into the mirror and saw Lily's tiny face, lips blue, eyes shut. He nearly broke, but he remembered his vow and whispered, "We will build you a place." The mirror cleared, and for a moment he thought he heard a woman sob with relief. On other nights the hotel played crueler games. Ethan returned from a patrol to find a length of chain neatly coiled on the lobby desk like a gift. He would blink and it would be gone. He would hear the click of a latch and discover every window on the third floor standing an inch ajar, as if the building itself needed to breathe. He would close them and hear each reopen in sequence, left to right, as if marking time. He stopped sleeping. He ate because Clara shoved a sandwich into his hand. Marcus brought coffee in paper cups whose rims left pale half-moons on the ledger. The three of them became a small, odd family: the researcher, the proprietor, the guilt-bearer. The hotel watched them and weighed them and found them wanting but persistent. A week before the 12th, Clara pressed a folded list into Ethan's palm. "Read these names aloud at midnight," she said. "In order. Abigail wants to be first. That is her right. But the others must be named too. The order matters because order was denied to them in life." "What if she interrupts?" Ethan asked. "She will," Clara said. "You will continue anyway." That night Ethan stood in the third-floor hallway with the list in his shaking hand. The lamp in 313 burned low and steady. The orchids were white and the brass shackles gleamed like instruments tuned for cruel music. He read: Abigail Harrow, Lily Harrow, John Marrow, Eliza Kane, Samuel Holt, Margaret Wren, Daniel Fong, Lucy Tate. On Lily's name, the lullaby wavered. On Lucy's name, the doll in 319 turned its head. Ethan finished and folded the paper without daring to breathe. "Not enough," a voice whispered from the mirror, not a hiss this time but a tired condemnation. The glass did not show Abigail's face. It showed a doorway in an empty field standing without walls. Through the door, Ethan could see the outline of a stone with no letters. He understood. Names require letters. Letters require hands. Hands require the living. Prove it. "I will," he said aloud. "I'm proving it now." The mirror clouded, then cleared to his own face. The hotel relented one notch. The lamp dimmed but did not go out. The Masons arrived, men from down the highway with quiet eyes and old trucks. Marcus met them before dawn. "You'll work through the night if you have to," he said. "No shortcuts. This is not a vanity project." They nodded, perhaps understanding more than they let on. Hammers rang. The sound threaded the bones of the hotel. In 313 the lamp shook as if a distant storm were passing. The cradle rocked once and stilled. Ethan hauled gravel, sweating in the cool morning, grateful for the simplicity of labor. Clara supervised the placement of the central plinth. She carried the engraved bronze plate wrapped in canvas as a priestess might carry a relic. When she unwrapped it, the names shone, new and solemn. She ran a finger across the lettering of * Abigail Harrow and seemed to bless the air. "We're close," she said, not smiling, not crying. "Hold." "Hold," Ethan echoed, as if bracing a door against wind. That evening the hotel retaliated. As dusk sagged over Black Hollow, the chandeliers lit themselves and burned two hot glass teeth glowing white. The radio on Ethan's belt spat static threaded with a lullaby off-key. The doors to 315 through 320 opened in a ripple. In each room the artifact lifted: apron, cap, spectacles, ladle, doll, boot. They hovered, choosing. Then they dropped as one. The thuds marched down the hall like a verdict. Ethan stepped back, heart hammering. "We're almost there," he said to the air, to Abigail, to himself. "Give us the night." A breath moved past his ear. It sounded like the word * hurry worn down by 100 years. The eve of December 12th arrived. The garden stood ready in raw beauty. A rectangle of granite chips framed by stone, a central plinth, 7 small markers ringed by low iron. Clara had placed orchids in water at each marker: white for the women and child, white for Lily with a ribbon the color of dusk, white for John and Daniel with thin sprigs of sage, white for Samuel with a hotel bell set beside the vase like a coin on a tongue. Marcus strung low lights in the pepper trees. The courtyard smelled of damp stone and new metal. Inside, the altar in the lobby waited. Artifacts in a semicircle, photograph and dress scrap at the center, the oil lamp from 313 steady beside them. A small crowd had gathered by invitation. 2 council members, the librarian who had helped Clara, an elderly miner who remembered Victor's temper from childhood stories, and a pair of teenagers who had sworn to keep quiet about the ambulance. They were hushed in the way of people who have stumbled into a church without meaning to. Clara stepped to the altar and read a brief history, her voice clean. She did not spare Victor. She did not soften Abigail. She said the names precisely, letting each rest in the air until it found its place. Marcus spoke next, awkward and sincere, promising the hotel would never again bury its dead in plaster and quiet. He looked smaller when he finished, as if paying a tax long overdue. Ethan did not speak. That was by design. His part was labor, attention, the willingness to be present when the building decided whether to forgive. He stood at the edge of the lobby and watched the lamp. When its flame leaned toward him, he leaned back. When it straightened, he exhaled. He felt like a man keeping time for an orchestra whose conductor was in the walls. Near midnight, the crowd filed to the garden. The air was cold enough to pinch tears from eyes. Clara handed Ethan a box of matches. "Light it," she whispered. "Begin." He struck a match and set a votive at the foot of the plinth. The small flame steadied, then grew. He lit 6 more, one at each marker. As he spoke the names, wind pressed the candles but did not take them. Abigail Harrow, Lily Harrow, John Marrow, Eliza Kane, Samuel Holt, Margaret Wren, Daniel Fong, Lucy Tate. A hush pulled tight over the courtyard. From the open doorway of the lobby, the lullaby traveled out and became, for the first time, a melody untouched by rage. The Masons stood with heads bare. The teenagers sobbed without understanding why. Marcus gripped the back of a chair and did not let go. "Do you feel it?" Clara murmured. "Yes," Ethan said, because he did. The hotel had stopped fighting. It was listening. The last test came when they returned inside. The lamp in 313 had gone out. Ethan felt the absence like pain. He and Clara climbed the stairs alone. Marcus remained below to distract the guests with coffee that tasted like burnt sugar. The third-floor hallway glowed with a light that came from nowhere recognizable. The doors to 315 and 320 were closed. Only 313 stood slightly ajar. Ethan put his hand on the wood. It was cool for the first time in memory. "Abigail," Clara said softly, "we have kept our part." Ethan opened the door. The room was clean. The shackles remained, but their brass was dull, as if fingers had stopped polishing grief into them. The orchids were white and simple. On the small table beneath the lamp lay a folded note. Ethan reached for it and hesitated. Clara nodded. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was older than the hotel and newer than ink. "Thank you for giving us a place." It was signed with a single initial, A. A sound like relief moved through the walls, timbers settling, plaster easing. The Orchids of Room 313, Part 5. December 12th dawned cold and thin, the sun a pale disk straining through overcast skies. Frost jeweled the windows of the Crescent Hotel, blurring the view of the new memorial garden beyond. Ethan stood in the lobby, weary but upright, as Clara arranged orchids along the altar. Marcus paced with a ledger of expenses he no longer pretended to balance. The air carried a hush too dense for morning, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath. At noon the masons finished tightening the last iron rail around the garden. The plinth stood ready, 7 names carved deep into the bronze plate: Abigail Harrow, Lily Harrow, John Marrow, Eliza Kane, Samuel Holt, Margaret Wren, Daniel Fong, Lucy Tate. Visitors trickled in from Black Hollow, skeptical townsfolk, 2 councilmen, the librarian, the teenagers sworn to secrecy, an old miner with bowed legs. They gathered with hats in hand, their silence an odd companion to the desert wind. Clara spoke first, recounting what had been hidden, Victor Caldwell's sins, the voices silenced. She spoke their names one by one, the syllables steady, exact. Marcus followed, blunt and brief, promising the hotel would no longer bury truth in plaster. Finally, Ethan stepped forward. He had no prepared speech. He held the folded note signed A in his pocket and simply said, "We see you now." The garden fell still. The wind quieted. Candles set at each marker guttered but did not go out. For the first time, Ethan felt the silence of the hotel extend outward, past the stones, past the town, into the wide basin of the desert. It was not hostile, it was waiting. That night the final reckoning came. The guests gone, the courtyard empty, Ethan and Clara remained in the lobby. The lamp from 313 had not relit since the ceremony. The shackles lay dull against the wall. And yet Ethan knew the test was not complete. He climbed the stairs with Clara beside him. The third floor was hushed. Doors 315 through 320 were closed, artifacts at rest. Only 313 stood open. Inside, the cradle was gone. In its place lay a mound of soil, fresh and dark, sprouting orchids so white they seemed carved from bone. At the top of the mound sat the note Ethan had carried all day, now unfolded though he had never touched it. The words glowed faintly, "Peace is earned." The lullaby rose one last time, soft and whole. Not a shriek, not a demand, just a song, the melody of a mother to her child. Ethan closed his eyes. In the darkness he saw Abigail holding Lily, not shackled, not bloodied, simply swaying with her daughter in her arms. The image trembled, then faded like a candle burning to its end. When Ethan opened his eyes, the mound was gone. Only orchids remained, their petals untouched by frost or dust. Weeks later, the Crescent Hotel opened as a museum. The memorial garden drew visitors from Black Hollow and beyond. Children pressed fingers to the bronze plate, reading the names aloud as though keeping the promise alive. Clara curated displays with meticulous care. Abigail's photograph, the nurse's spectacles, the miner's boot, the doll. Marcus gave tour, his gruff voice gentler now. Ethan patrolled the halls, not as a guard against spirits but as a caretaker of memory. Room 313 remained locked, not by rule but by respect. Inside, the lamp stayed dark. The shackles no longer gleamed. Yet each week Ethan unlocked the door to check. The air smelled only of dust and cedar. The orchids, impossibly, remained fresh. One evening near closing, Ethan entered alone and found a new note on the table. The same hand, the same faint glow. "Thank you for giving us a place." It was signed again with a single initial, A. Ethan folded it carefully, slid it into his ledger beside the first, and closed the door. This time, the brass numerals did not shine. They simply rested as though content. Downstairs, Clara called his name and Marcus asked about the evening rounds. The hotel creaked once, not in protest, but in rhythm with the lives now filling it. Ethan touched the banister, breathed the cool air, and walked toward them. The Crescent Hotel had not forgotten, but it had forgiven, and for Ethan Caldwell that was enough. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace. Ethan often thought of the faces he had seen in dreams, of the corridors that once demanded his fear. Now they were only corridors, long and quiet, their plaster patched, their windows open to the sun. He walked them without dread, but with the careful reverence of one entrusted with graves. Clara continued her research, compiling a book to donate to the town library. Marcus aged visibly but seemed lighter, his shoulders no longer bent by secrets. The town began to speak of the hotel not with dread but with respect, as a place of history instead of hunger. And on certain evenings, when the wind was soft, Ethan swore he heard a lullaby that no longer chilled the blood, a song that belonged to a child cradled at last in peace.